Great, thank you, Mario. And thank you for the very kind introduction. Please let me know if you can't hear me. Okay, great. And as Mario said, I'm Amy Lavelle. I'm a staff scientist in the theory group at Los Alamos. And today I'm going to be talking to you about some of my thesis work, actually, and the work that has come out of it at MSU and the NSCL about uncertainty quantification for reaction theory, specifically for few body reactions. Okay. So I'm gonna begin by briefly explaining sort of the uncertainty sources that we have in few body reactions before going into the methods that we've been using to quantify these uncertainties, both chi-square minimization methods, which have historically been the more standard methods to use, and then into the Bayesian methods that have really picked up a lot of steam in the recent past, I suppose, especially in this community. I'll show results for both of these methods, and then do show some work that we did looking at a comparison between these two methods. And then finally, I'll make a connection to some of the work I'm doing now at Los Alamos, as I've sort of shifted gears since I left the NSCL, and then give a summary. And just to sort of give more detail to this outline, here is a list of the works that we've published sort of in this series of trying to quantify reactions and uncertainties. So if you're interested in getting more of the details, you can look at any of these. They cover sort of different subsets of this work, and I'll show things from primarily these first 5 papers, and then on Thursday, actually, you get a continuation in this uncertainty quantification mini series week when Manuel is going to talk about this recent paper in gray here that we looked at. And I'll discuss a little bit about this work that we sort of are prepping right now, and again, some connection to the work that I'm doing in Los Alamos. And so uncertainty quantification has really picked up steam in nuclear theory over the last at least 5 years, but maybe probably more than that. And it would be very hard on 1 or 2 slides to really capture the full suite of work that has been done. So instead, I'm putting up sort of these 2 overview papers that there were these special issues in JPhysG, one from 2015 that sort of kicked off this collaboration that's been going on between nuclear theorists, experimentalists, and statisticians to really get at quantifying theoretical uncertainties. And there's actually right now going on and accepting publications the second version of the paper, which is up and constantly being added to on JPhysG. And these 2 journal entries, along with many other publications in PhysRev Letters, PhysRev C, JPhysG, European physics journals, sort of span really the suite of calculations that have been going on everywhere, from ab initio calculations to effective field theory to density functional theory, obviously our stuff in few body reactions, to more even like heavy ion collisions. There's just really a lot of people have been looking at how to really rigorously quantify uncertainties in nuclear theory so that we can really give a more honest look at what our theories can and cannot do. And so particularly in few body reaction theory, we've generally been splitting our uncertainties into 2 different types. This would be the statistical uncertainties here on the right, which deal with sort of more numerics. How do the functions converge? Have we included a big enough model space that our calculations have converged? Do we have constraints on parameters? What do those look like? How do those propagate from whatever has been fit to the final calculation or results that we're comparing to experiments, say? and then systematic uncertainties that deal more with, say, the shape of the potential that we're using. If we're using a mean field-like potential, is it a Wood-Saxon? Is it a Gaussian? And then how do we simplify our model? Specifically, right, we're looking at few body reactions here. So how do we go from the many body problem to, say, a 2 or 3 body problem? And what types of degrees of freedom, say, does that leave out of our calculation, and what impact does that have? So over the past several years, we've identified 4 main sources of uncertainties in our few body reaction theories. The first one, and the one that we've been focusing on really for the past 5 or so years, and have really done a lot of work to get at, are the effective potentials that we use in our problems, the interaction between a scattering neutron and a heavy target. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today, because it's, again, where most of our work has gone. But then we also, have approximations made in the few body problem. How exactly are we solving the few body problem? What, are we using an adiabatic method, a distorted wave method? And I'll discuss a little bit more about that in a slide or two. The structure functions that go into our problem, say, what is the even binding potential when you have a single nucleon transfer that holds that neutron onto your heavy target? And then, as I sort of mentioned before, the missing degrees of freedom that we leave out of our problem when we go from a many body problem to a few body problem. And again, I'll mostly focus on the effective potentials, but I'll mention these other 3 sources and where we're going with these sort of towards the end of the talk. And so the reactions that we're interested in that we've been studying are really DP reactions. So we have a deuteron that's impinging on a heavy target. It transfers, typically we've been looking at single neutron transfers, so it transfers a neutron to the target, and then the proton flies away. And there are 2 models in particular that I'm going to be talking about. So just so we're on the same page, right? We want to typically solve this full 3-body problem, but we make approximations on the exact wave function, because again, solving, a 40, 50 body problem is typically computationally difficult. So the 2 approximations that I'm going to talk about today, or at least I'm going to mention in terms of our uncertainty quantification studies, are the adiabatic wave approximation and the distorted wave Born approximation. And so the distorted wave Born approximation, DWBA, is sort of the simpler of the 2 models, where it just uses an effective deuteron target potential to replace this exact wave function with essentially the neutron-proton bound state and then a deuteron scattering state. So you need the potential that tells you how the deuteron interacts with the heavy target. The adiabatic wave approximation, sort of the next step in the approximation, where it takes into account the breakup of the deuteron, which has been known to be very important for many transfer reactions. And so this actually needs both the neutron target, I don't remember which colors are which anymore, but the neutron target and proton target potentials so that it can take this breakup into account. And so then the potentials we're interested in studying, this is again where most of the uncertainties we've been looking at are coming from, are these phenomenological optical model potentials. Generally have a real part and an imaginary term, which the imaginary term takes into account any loss of flux from channels that aren't explicitly in your reaction model. It consists of volume, surface, and spin orbit terms, where the volume term is typically parameterized as a Wood-Saxon that has 3 free parameters. It's a depth, a radius, and a diffuseness. And then the surface and spin orbit terms are typically derivatives of Wood-Saxons. And so in most of the models we've been looking at, and the potentials that we've been looking at, and how we've been doing our optimization, we have a real and an imaginary volume term, and then an imaginary surface term. And these are the free parameters that we worry about optimizing. We typically fit or fix the spin orbit term to whatever global model we're looking at. And then when we have neutron scattering or charged particle scattering, we fix the Coulomb term as well. And so we don't try to optimize any of these parameters. And so this leaves us with somewhere between 6 and 12 free parameters. Most of the cases I'll be talking about are about 9 that we have to optimize and propagate through our models. And so, as I mentioned in the beginning, there are really 2 types of uncertainty quantification that we've been looking into. The first is, sort of the very familiar chi-square minimization and covariance propagation, which I will try to refer to as that, but I might also call it frequentist method because this has kind of become our nomenclature that we've been using. And right, the idea is that you are trying to find a set of best fit parameters that minimizes the chi-square. So you're trying to minimize the residuals between your model and the data, weighted by typically an experimental uncertainty. And one of the assumptions that goes into the standard chi-square minimization is that both the model residuals are normally distributed, sort of with a variance of the experimental uncertainty, but also that the resulting parameters and the parameter space distribution is normally distributed about the best fit set of parameters. And so under this assumption, we can construct a covariance matrix between the different parameters in our model. We scale it as shown here by essentially the chi-square value, chi-square per degrees of freedom to take into account the goodness of fit. So this kind of either expands or shrinks the parameter space based on how well these parameters cause the model to match the data. And then once we have this normal distribution, we can sample parameter sets from it and run these sets through the models to propagate the uncertainties from the parameters to, say, an elastic cross-section. Ultimately, we calculate typically 95% confidence intervals on our reaction observables. And this is done, again, pulling a certain number of parameter sets. We've been looking at anywhere between 200 to 1600, propagating them through the model, and then at each angle that we're calculating, right, we're typically looking at cross sections or differential cross sections. We remove the top 2.5% of the calculations and the lowest 2.5% calculations at each angle. And then this allows you to construct bands around your best fit. And this was, again, work that I did during my PhD, and it makes use of, have a sort of an augmented version of Ian Thompson's Fresco and S-Fresco package. And then the second optimization technique that we've been looking at, and as I had mentioned in the beginning, is really gaining a lot of traction right now, is Bayesian optimization. And I'll talk about the differences a little bit more when I discuss the work that we did to really compare these two. But one of, sort of off the bat, things that people like about Bayes' theorem more than these frequentist or chi-square methods is sort of the philosophy behind them, that in principle, it gives you a way to say what the uncertainty is on something without having to know all possible outcomes. So you can say, there's a 30% chance that it's going to snow tomorrow without having to know that, well, it could snow, or it could rain, or it could be sunny, or it could be overcast. You don't have to know the whole suite of outcomes. And so Bayes' theorem is given here in the top with these lovely colored boxes to show the different parts of it. And really what you want to do is calculate the posterior distribution, which is the probability that the model or your parameters are correct after seeing the data. And what goes into it is, in green here, the prior distribution. So what you know about, again, your model or your parameters before you've seen the data. A likelihood distribution, which takes into account the goodness of fit between the model and the data, how well the model describes the data. And so this contains your chi-square information. And we've been using an exponentiated chi-square, which seems to be pretty standard. The last part of Bayes' theorem down here in the bottom is the evidence, or the Bayesian evidence. It's the marginal distribution of the data given the likelihood in the prior. And this typically consists of a sum or an integral over your whole model space and all possible models. And so as you can imagine, this is typically either very computationally expensive or near impossible to calculate. So instead of directly integrating all of these parts and calculating the posterior distribution, what often happens is that people run a Markov chain Monte Carlo to accept and reject. For us, it'd be parameter sets that either do a good job describing the model or don't do a good job describing the model. So we can numerically get at the posterior distribution. And all the results that I will show for this take that approach. Then again, we define confidence intervals, not in the way of the chi-square minimization, which we remove a percentage at the top and the percentage at the bottom. But in this case, they're defined by, say, at each angle of our observable, you take the densest region of the observable space. So that means that they don't necessarily have to be symmetric within all of your model poles. And the work that I'm going to show today for our prior distribution, we take independent exponentials across each of our different parameters. And I did a fair investigation of a couple of different spaces, as have other groups, and to really find, how much does your resulting calculation depend on your prior distribution. And if your data has enough constraining power in it, your resulting posterior distribution should be fairly independent of the choice of the prior. And that's more or less what we've seen. And again, this whole suite of codes that developed was again built on top of Fresco, which was a very nice tool to have to start this off. And so first, I'm going to show an example of the confidence intervals that we get from fitting elastic scattering with this chi-square minimization. And for this, I'm using the transfer example we're looking at is carbon-12 dp at about 12 MeV, and this is done under the approximation of DWBA. So I'm showing here the deuteron carbon-12 elastic scattering cross-section. And we can see that after we go through this whole procedure, we do the minimization, construct the parameter space, make our draws, propagate them through the model. These are the confidence bands or intervals that we get. And so the red line shows the best fit compared to the data in black, with the brown hashed regions are the confidence intervals. And we sort of notice immediately, I would say, two things from these results. One is that the confidence intervals are actually very narrow. And the second one is one of the downsides of just doing this chi-square minimization is this assumption of normally distributed residuals that you can see for places that our model is above the data. We also have regions where the model is below the data, because typically through these types of procedures, you want to have as many points below the best fit as above the best fit, which may lead to some unphysical results just because of the statistics of the method. We also, from this method, can look at correlations in parameter space. So for example, I'm showing these contour regions of the colors indicate actually a chi-square value. So this is in chi-square space, say between the radius of the real volume and the diffuseness of the real volume, where you can see the very oval-like and tilted parameters means you have highly correlated parameters, and sort of the more tilt you have, the more correlated your parameters are. And then in some cases, like between the depth of the imaginary surface term, and again, the radius of the real volume term, more uncorrelated parameters, where we have more, I would say it's flatter in parameter space. You can have a larger change in R without much of a change in WS. So then we can propagate these parameters to our DP calculation. And in this work, we only looked at the uncertainties coming from the deuteron scattering at the target and not the outgoing channel as well. So the proton carbon-13 potential, which obviously goes into this reaction formalism. We have since looked at that, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But we can see again, so here's the differential cross-section for the transfer calculation at, again, about 12 MeV as a function of angle. And we can see, again, we have very narrow confidence intervals, especially compared to the experimental error on this data. See at the peak, we do a pretty good job of reproducing the shape of the data. And again, this data was not put into the calculation in any way. But then as we get to more backwards angles, we have this sort of shift in the angular pattern, which isn't accounted for in the uncertainties that we have in our model, right? The bands or these intervals are not wide enough to take into account or to overlap with all of this data. And so that's maybe one thing that we see right away with these chi-square methods is that the uncertainties tend to be very narrow. And not that, we want to artificially inflate our uncertainties or we want to say that our models are way worse than they are, right? Having low uncertainties is good, but we just want to make sure that we are accurately representing the uncertainties that are in our model. And in a couple slides, when I talk about the comparison between this and the Bayesian method, I'll show you one way that we've been diagnosing that. So then next, I want to talk about the Bayesian results. And this is, we're moving on to a slightly heavier target. We're now going to look at calcium-48 DP and under the adiabatic approximation. So now we need neutron scattering at half of the deuteron incident energy and the proton scattering at half of the deuteron energy. And so here, remember, the thing that we get out of the Bayesian methods is the posterior distributions. So I'm showing you the posterior distributions for each of the parameters that were fit within the model. And so these are the real volume terms, the depth, the radius, and the diffuseness, followed by the imaginary surface, depth, radius, and diffuseness, and then the imaginary volume, depth, radius, and diffuseness. And in these solid lines, which hopefully you can see, those are the prior distribution that we put into our model. So again, we use a Gaussian, and we use a very wide Gaussian to allow the data to constrain the parameters as much as possible. And maybe the thing that you notice first is that our posteriors that we get out, the histograms, are definitely not Gaussian, right? In some cases, we have these long tails, like in the imaginary surface radius. Sometimes we have sort of double peaked structures. And again, in the chi-square minimization, we sort of have to assume that everything is Gaussian. And so immediately we're seeing differences when we use a different type of optimization scheme. So then we can propagate these to our elastic scattering cross-sections, which I'm showing here for each of the potentials that we need to optimize in order to calculate the transfer cross-section. Again, here's the neutron target and proton target scattering that go into the deuteron, and then the outgoing proton target angular distribution as well. And in this case, as I guess you'll notice right now, is that we're now optimizing these three potentials instead of just looking at the incident deuteron target potential. And for the most part, you can see that in general, the confidence intervals are wider than what we had from the chi-square minimization. And I'll give you an opportunity to see these side by side in a little bit. And also where before some of the data was outside of the confidence intervals, we pretty much capture all of the data now within our 95% confidence intervals. So then we can propagate these to the transfer cross-section, again, using the adiabatic wave approximation, which is shown here on the left. We're getting calcium-48 DP scattering at about 24 MeV. And also you'll notice that these intervals again are a lot wider than what we saw for the carbon-12 chi-square case, and at least up to 60 degrees that I'm showing in this plot, even though you can tell that the angular pattern is a little shifted between the calculation and the data that we show, we pretty much, the intervals are wide enough that we capture these differences. This is also, the data is at a slightly different energy than the calculation is, so that also could account for this shift in angular distribution. I'm also showing here, we've termed the percent uncertainty on this calculation. So it's the width of these intervals divided by the mean value. And so you can see at, say, the peak of the distribution where we would extract a spectroscopic factor, for example, we have about 40% uncertainty, which you may think is a little wider than, or larger than what we would ideally like. And I believe on Thursday, again, I'm going to plug Manuel's talk. He's going to be talking about some of the things that we've looked at to try to reduce these uncertainties. So then the next thing I want to talk about is this work that was led by Garrett King, who was an undergrad with us at MSU and is now a grad student at WashU in St. Louis, led this nice effort to really directly compare the uncertainties between the chi-square minimization and the Bayesian methods. Right, what we had found is that a lot of people have switched completely over from chi-square minimization to Bayesian methods, but never really did this in-between step of saying, okay, yeah, I like the philosophy of the Bayesian better, I think it's more realistic, but what is the difference here? What do we gain and what do we lose when we switch over these methods? And so this is, again, we use the example of calcium 48 dp with the adiabatic wave approximation, and ran the calculations both for the chi-square, which is this blue F calculation frequentist, compared to the Bayesian. And here I'm showing the elastic scattering for the neutron, proton, and outgoing proton, scattering to constrain those potentials, and then these percent confidence intervals. And so you can really directly here see that the chi-square calculations produce significantly smaller confidence intervals than the Bayesian do. And here, right, the fits look really nice, right? We go, even with the chi-square, you go through all the data in each of these three cases. But the question that we really want to ask ourselves is, okay, you know, we want smaller uncertainties, right? We want to be more sure about our calculations, but we also want uncertainties that are reliable. And we don't want to either overinflate or underinflate our uncertainties just to make ourselves feel better or more confident. And so we looked at this by calculating the percent of data that falls within each percent of these confidence intervals. So before I was showing you this high end of the 95% confidence intervals, but we can also construct 20%, 40%, etc. confidence intervals and calculate how much of the data that we fit is within each one. And so these black lines on each plot show you if our calculation was completely honest, we should expect, say, 20% of the data to fall within the 20% confidence intervals, and so on. And so for these three scattering cases that we looked at, comparing again in blue the chi-square calculations, and in orange the Bayesian calculations, we see that almost consistently the chi-square calculations fall below this line. So essentially our confidence intervals are too small and unrealistically small. The Bayesian, on the other hand, falls for the most part, besides maybe this last case, above the line. So although our uncertainties are a little wider than we would maybe ideally expect, we're at least being too conservative with the uncertainties, as opposed to being unrealistically small. And so this is actually one of the things that we've been pointing to, aside from this approximation of Gaussian space when we have non-Gaussian parameters and a non-linear propagation to our models, but saying that in the Bayesian case, our uncertainties are much more accurately reproduced than in the frequentist case, in the chi-square case. And so for us, this gave us a lot of confidence of, yes, we really do want to push ahead with the Bayesian methods and sort of leave the chi-square behind. And so the other thing that we looked at in this work was parameter correlations, because especially for the optical model parameters, there's historically, the parameters have been said to be very highly correlated. And actually, if you look at the chi-square minimization in blue, that's what you see, right? Let me explain this plot first before I get into the details, but along the diagonal, we have the posterior distributions of the parameters, which are named along the bottom and up the side. So you can see the minimum and in parameter space and how wide each of these distributions are. You notice again, for all of the chi-square minimizations, these are very Gaussian. On the off diagonals, we have all of the parameter samples that we've done as scatter plots so we can look at the correlations. And so for the chi-square minimization, we see that these parameters are really highly correlated, pretty much in every case that we've looked at. And this is specifically for the neutron scattering at 12 MeV on calcium-48, but this is also the case in pretty much every other example we've looked at so far. So yeah, we have highly correlated parameters for the chi-square minimization method, but then when we go to the Bayesian Monte Carlo sampling, you see that there are much more rounded correlations, essentially many fewer correlations between the parameters, except between the depth and the radius of the real volume term. And so this is something that not many people have seen before, that sort of goes against the standard idea that all of the optical model parameters are very highly correlated. And we see when we use these different methods, we don't necessarily get the strong correlation anymore, which can have, which makes a difference when you propagate your parameters to the resulting observables. The other thing I want to point out is that you'll notice not all of these parameters have a calculation for the chi-square minimization. And so one of the things that happens often when we run the chi-square minimization is that if you let all the parameters vary simultaneously, many of them will be pushed outside of physical space. And so oftentimes we have to fix these parameters at a certain value and let the rest vary freely, which essentially takes them out of the minimization procedure, and then we don't necessarily see how they propagate towards the observables or how correlated they are. And so that, again, is another difference between these two techniques, where we have not had a problem with the Bayesian method of parameters going outside of their sort of viable regions. And one of the things that helps with this is that we do put a prior distribution on our parameter space. So if you saw something try to slide outside of the physical region, you could really constrain it and keep it where it's supposed to be. But again, in all of these cases, we've used very large priors with a width that's equal to the mean value or the global value for these parameters. And so we're really not constraining the parameters with our prior. We're letting the data do all of the talking. And still we see this, the Bayesian methods keep the parameters in a more physical region than typically the chi-square gradient descent methods do. And so then I briefly, I spent most of my time talking about how we've been constraining uncertainties on the optical potentials, but we had these three other sources of uncertainties, and we have been doing some work to look at, how can we include the uncertainties from those sources into our final calculation. And I'm gonna briefly mention some of the things that we've looked at and where we're going on these. So one of the other sources of uncertainties was the few body approximation, right? I've talked both about the DWBA and ADWA calculations. And so we've looked at how these two calculations differ when you only look at uncertainties coming from the optical potentials. And those are the examples shown here. So now we have both an example of zirconium 90 dp for the chi-square minimization, and then zirconium 90 dp, so the same reaction using the Bayesian optimization. And you can see that now we've computed the parametric uncertainties for each of the optical potentials, the scattering potentials that go into these calculations, and then propagated all the way through to the transfer cross-section for both cases. And we see immediately that for ADWA and DWBA, there is a difference in the shape of the transfer cross-section. It's sort of significant, right? Especially at forward angles, the ADWA does not go as low as the DWBA calculation does. And even at these sort of intermediate 30-degree angles, there's a very different shape between the two. And when you use the chi-square minimization and propagate that way, the uncertainties really coming from our nucleon scattering are small enough that you can really see the difference between these two calculations and whether the data would maybe fall within one uncertainty interval or the other, or between, as is the case here. When you go to the Bayesian methods, we're looking specifically at the black or gray intervals and the green here. We see that, again, as we saw before, the confidence intervals are much wider, and they overlap significantly more than we have with the chi-square minimization. And so again, this is another reason why we're looking to understand how we can better constrain our potentials. But ultimately, what we also want to be able to do is say, how much uncertainty are we including when we go from the adiabatic approximation to the slightly, I want to say worse, but right, it's a deuteron in the DWBA as opposed to the nucleon scattering. And so we want to be able to fold that type of uncertainty into these parametric with these parametric uncertainties, instead of just saying, okay, we have these two models and how different are they? The next thing that we had was the structure functions. Right now, I'm thinking specifically about, again, the binding potential of the transferred neutron to the heavy target, which we haven't looked at all in these calculations. We use some sort of standard geometry and then fit the depth of this interaction to reproduce the binding energy between the binding of the neutron and target. And this is stuff that I did just at the end of my thesis work, that, just to see, trying to use actually the transfer cross-section itself to constrain the single particle geometry. And ultimately, it would be much better to use an independent constraint, such as the asymptotic normalization coefficient, to really be able to constrain this geometry so that we can make a full prediction for the transfer cross-section, as opposed to having to feed in the transfer data. And this is something that Nick Crelio at MSU is currently working on. So then the last piece is the degrees of freedom left out of the model, right? What do we lose when we go from, say, a many-body problem to a few-body problem? And one of the things we looked at very briefly, sort of in conjunction with this chi-square minimization paper that we had, was, what do we gain when we fit both elastic scattering and inelastic scattering. So using a couple channel calculation as opposed to just a single channel calculation versus just fitting elastic scattering. And that's what I'm showing here for calcium-48 neutron elastic in this first column and inelastic scattering. And this top blue section is just fitting the elastic scattering calculation and propagating to the inelastic versus fitting both the elastic and the inelastic with a slightly different model. And so you can see, as we would expect when we fit two sets of data, we have smaller confidence intervals than when we just fit one set of data. And we also do a better job describing the inelastic scattering when that is included in the model, but also, again, with a slightly different model. And so this is something we are sort of working on a little more now, doing this in a Bayesian method. And you want to be able to say, one, what is the uncertainty of leaving out these degrees of freedom, but at what point is it necessary to include these? And so, yeah, that's hopefully you'll see some more stuff from our group about this in the future. And so then the last thing I want to do before I finish, I would be really remiss if I didn't connect my previous work to the work that I'm doing now at Los Alamos. And so one of the big things that gets done at Los Alamos in the theory group and other groups around the lab is really nuclear data evaluations. So it's a big contributors to the NDEF evaluated nuclear data files, which is, again, a combination of data, models, fitting to produce these best values for a range of reactions and uncertainties on top of these. And so one of the thrusts that's been happening recently, particularly spearheaded by Denise Neudecker at Los Alamos, is including good and reliable experimental uncertainties into these, into the evaluation routines and methods. And she's been pushing really hard for templates of experimental uncertainty, where this is an example for fission cross-sections, but go through the experimental data, see these different types of experiments that take place, what are the different sources of uncertainties, what are typical values for these uncertainties, so that if, say, you have old data that only in X4, there's only statistical uncertainties, which are much smaller than the total source of uncertainties. You have a template that says, okay, I know approximately how much uncertainty I should add to this calculation so that I can better represent, better represent the uncertainties that actually were in the experiment. And she also gives guidelines of, how correlated are these uncertainties? Because in all of the work that we've done so far with this Bayesian and chi-square, we assume our experimental uncertainties are fully uncorrelated. They're essentially just diagonal, but that's not necessarily the case in all points and for all types of uncertainties, right? If you say have a normalization uncertainty, you expect that all of your points would move up or down together. So these would, for example, be fully correlated uncertainties. And she found that this can actually have a very large impact on your resulting mean values, which these two plots show the changes of the mean value and uncertainty compared to the baseline calculation for including different types of uncertainties for either full knowledge of for a single experiment, correlated within experiments, correlated between experiments. For here on the left is the mean best value, and then on the right you have the uncertainties. And so you can see that in some cases, maybe the mean value doesn't change that much when you add these correlations, but then when you go to calculate the uncertainties for each of these, you can get changes, around 30% or so on the uncertainties. And again, when we're trying to accurately represent our uncertainties, this is maybe something that we then want to take into account in our model uncertainties as well, a more accurate representation of the experimental uncertainties. Because I kind of swept it under the rug, but for all of our calculations, we've assumed 10% uncertainties, independent uncertainties on the experiments. And we're also using, for the most part, older data that maybe is only statistical and doesn't give systematic uncertainties. And so we've taken this value, but having a method to provide more realistic experimental uncertainties could be something that we could include in the future in all of this theory uncertainty work. And then one of the other pushes that has been going on recently is a lot of groups are exploring machine learning or machine learning like methods as a tool for uncertainty quantification. Particularly recently, there's been a lot of work with Gaussian processes and Bayesian neural networks to either fill in a sparse data set, emulate a model, or propagate uncertainties beyond experimental data. And this is ranging everywhere from EFT calculations, density functional theory, and even fission yields. And so one of the projects that I've been working on, was particularly a big part of my postdoc work at Los Alamos, was looking into probabilistic machine learning algorithms as a tool for emulation, uncertainty quantification. And so, right, a typical machine learning algorithm is just some, highly non-linear network, a model that is just trying to map an input X to an output Y. And it's typically deterministic. What we've been looking at is this mixture density network, which says instead of directly mapping my input to my output, I'm going to describe my output as a sum of Gaussians. And then I'm going to use the ML algorithm to determine the weight, the mean, and the standard deviation for each of these Gaussians. And this gives a way to propagate uncertainties because right at every point you're predicting, you actually have a distribution of results. And so that's something we've been looking at fission mass yields. So this is just the probability that a fragment with mass, say 100 or so, or any value would be created in a fission event. And so we can see that using this MDN algorithm, we can actually get bands, and we're not just predicting a single value here. And so we've been looking at, how uncertainties on the input propagate to uncertainties on the prediction. And then this also, because we have a mixture of Gaussians, we can also look at how various data sets, and maybe not even overlapping data sets, what result you get from that. Because with a lot of standard techniques, you would put, say, 4 data sets into your algorithm, and you just get some sort of weighted average between them. And with this MDN, this is the plot I'm trying to show down here, we actually, if we put these 4 data sets indicated by these dashed lines with a given uncertainty in red, we can actually see that our algorithm, the results of which are in black, sort of peaks towards the data sets that have smaller uncertainties, but also still gives us a little bit of weight down here at this other further data point. So it gives, so we've been looking at seeing how we can use this to do fitting, propagate uncertainties, maybe emulate data sets, and sort of rigorously take into account these different sets that we would have and different uncertainties. And so in summary, right, I hope I've convinced you that uncertainty, or known already, this is gaining more prominence in nuclear theory, and methods recently have moved very much from chi-square minimization and covariance propagation to Bayesian methods, and are now even moving further to machine learning methods. Our group at the NSCL and MSU have studied both these chi-square minimization and Bayesian methods to constrain uncertainties, particularly focusing on the optical potential, and found significant differences between the two methods, particularly as I showed in the robustness of the uncertainties and in the correlations between our model parameters. And so then ongoing studies that our group is beginning are going to look at uncertainties from the other pieces of the few body problem so that we can really wrap this into a nice package and have as many sources of uncertainty as possible, and then find a way to reduce these uncertainties. And with that, I'd just like to thank my collaborators still at MSU and the NSCL, I guess soon to be FRIB, Philomena, Manuel, and Nick, Garrett, who is now at WashU, and then many of my collaborators at Los Alamos. And once again, I would like to mention that on Thursday, Manuel is going to be sort of continuing this little UQ series, looking and telling you about ways to reduce the uncertainties in the optical potential from experimental constraints. And with that, I'd like to thank all of you for listening, and I'd be happy to take any questions.